What's going on, everybody? We are back for another episode of what is quickly becoming one of my favorites. Mondays, I'm going to try to consistently pump out videos on me asking questions to this card community and featuring some of the responses that I think are really good ones. See, the thing about cards, the thing about anything in the economy is we all make the decisions. See, if we want modern cards to be the thing, the hot thing, then the market will decide that. If we think Mickey Mantle cards should be the most expensive vintage cards, then if we continue to buy them at the high prices and higher prices, it will continue to be the case. See, when we talk about supply and demand, we are the demand. So whatever we decide is what's going to happen. That's why I think this video idea, this series that we're doing, where I ask you a question and I get feedback from everyone, is so important, because ultimately we decide what's next. We decide the future of the hobby. So when we ask things like, what do we think is going to go up the most over the next few years? It all depends on what we are buying, what we are purchasing, what we want. If the community wants one thing, that's what's going to happen. If the community rejects something, that's what's going to happen. So what each other is thinking is important to have an idea of where everyone stands, because where everyone stands is going to determine the direction of this hobby as far as pricing goes. So in our first week, I asked the question of what do we think is going to go up in value the most over the next 10 years? And I got some great responses. And if you've not checked out last Monday's video, do that. But this week, I asked another question about what do we think is going to happen, but this time in 5 years. And we'll take a look at the question in a second. But it revolves around grading. And the thing about card collecting is at this point, we are fully entrenched in grading. There are some people that continue to not want to do grading, who are not into grading, and that's okay. But the overwhelming majority of the key cards, of the expensive cards, of the cards that many of us demand and want, are being graded. And there are, at the moment, multiple options for grading. We have lots of options for grading. So what the future of grading looks like, again, is determined by us. If we decide that we reject PSA, PSA will no longer be number one if we all move to a different company. If we all decide that SGC is not a company that we trust anymore, then SGC will obviously drop. Now, I'm not suggesting either of those things could happen, should happen, or will happen. All I'm saying is we control which companies survive and which companies don't. It does not take us looking much further than some of the negative news that has happened and some of the decisions and marketing choices of some of the big companies in the United States, and the effect that it's had from consumers and as a result on those businesses. That is the proof that if we all make a stand for something, it will change, or the company will change, or both. So let's take a look at the question that I posed last week. And I'm curious as to the responses that a lot of you are going to have for some of the common answers that were posted as a result of this question. Let's look at the question, then we'll take a look at some of the answers.
All right, after looking at the current status of the card grading market and knowing that PSA graded cards generally, especially in higher grades, sell for more than the other company's holders, what do you think will be the status of the card grading market in 5 years? Who will be the top company? who will be the top 3 companies? Will PSA continue to sell for more than the others? So this is what I posed last week, and I got a lot of really, really great responses. And I'm going to go ahead and share with you 3 themes, 3 things that continued to come up, and some of the comments that I was especially interested in those kind of 3 themes of responses. So the very first response, all right, and this comes from Mookie Chilson. Mookie Chilson has his own channel, which you should check out. He's a very lighthearted, likable guy. In 5 years, Fanatics will be a real player in the grading. They will be manufacturing the cards, opening the cards, and grading the cards. They will be a bigger behemoth than they are today, and they will need to sink their teeth into the secondary market to keep growing. So then there was another really well thought out response in the same kind of theme. So I wanted to give a few highlights on this. This says, as I see it, it all depends on whether or not Fanatics buys one of the grading companies. Beckett, most likely. If Fanatics buys a grading company, I see them selling their top-of-the-line products already graded at even higher prices. And then he goes on to say, if Fanatics doesn't buy Beckett or one of the other grading companies, I see Beckett closed in 5 years. I see SGC and PSA continuing, like I said earlier, but with PSA dominating the investor side of the hobby and autographs. I see SGC and CSG gaining on PSA both because of price and turnaround time, with SGC becoming the leader in the vintage market.
All right. So I think these are a couple of very astute responses. And what I think we need to kind of understand is more about Fanatics. See, Fanatics bought out Topps not all that long ago. And they're already really starting to get invested in the card market. And they've talked about a lot of the things that they're working on doing, that they're thinking about doing, that they're brainstorming on doing. And in the meantime, a lot of us we're just kind of speculating. Now, one of the ways that Fanatics has shown us that they're very serious on really doing some things with sports cards is, you know, they added the MLB debut patch onto player jerseys, which we've been told are eventually going to be patch cards. Now imagine that. A patch card in modern cards that have a patch that was worn by the player in their very first major league game. That is going to fetch some money for some of the big prospects and players that turn into superstars. Now, another thing that they did is they bought out PWCC, right? And PWCC is one of the bigger auction sites for cards, right? We've got eBay, which a lot of people use. And then we've got Golden, which is kind of growing, not super fast, but it's being used. I bought my first card off of Golden about a week ago, which I'll share in the not too distant future. And then PWCC, which historically is kind of vintage cards, which is interesting because when we think of Topps and we think of manufacturing, we think of modern cards, but they bought that platform. So now Fanatics has the manufacturing of cards, of new modern cards, and they have a way to auction cards with an auction forum site. Now, there's a lot more that Fanatics does, and I think it's kind of important to understand what else Fanatics does. So I'm going to show you, just real quickly, I'm going to show you what Fanatics' site shows and the things that that company covers, because they are much more than a company who makes fan paraphernalia and shirts and sweatshirts and jerseys and things. They are much bigger than that. In fact, I read recently that they're valued at like $30 billion. So it's a massive company that has bought Topps and is currently at war with Panini. Let's look at some of the other things that they are doing or working on.
All right, so if we just go over to their website, and this is under their businesses section. So obviously they have Fanatics Commerce. Now, these are the sweatshirts. This is the fan gear and that kind of stuff. And then they've got Fanatics Collectibles, which, again, is mostly, when we talk about that, we're talking about Topps, right? Because they purchase Topps. Well, they've also been getting into Fanatics betting and gaming. So they're going to have an online gaming platform. And then they have Fanatics Live, which consists of a few things just from reading over it. It's everything from how you buy things to when you buy things. And then Fanatics Events there at the bottom. And the Fanatics Events are going to be, you know, whether it be anything from meeting athletes to, you know, card show conventions. Now, if I go up to the top here, and then I go down and I click in this in the partnerships, this lists just some of the partnerships that Fanatics has. And it's alphabetical. So this is just the A's and then the B's. I mean, you got the Big Ten, you got the Celtics, you got Cal, you got the Bundesliga, you've got NFL teams. It's kind of unbelievable the partnerships they have. Just having a partnership with just the Cowboys there would be big. But a lot of these, you know, Bayern Munich and, you know, colleges like Florida. But when you're talking about soccer teams, Premier League teams, you're talking about college leagues, NFL teams, Kentucky Derby, there's a lot of stuff that they're making and partnering with. So there's a lot of power at a company who has partnerships like that.
So there's really a lot to kind of unpack here. Fanatics seems very committed to the sports card market. And they seems like they're trying to get, you know, all factors of production. They want to produce it. They want to sell it. They have outlets to sell it. I mean, another company that they own, or they're at least majority owners of, is Lids. And they've already come out and talked about some special hats that they're going to do of teams that incorporate some Topps brands and images with some of their, you know, different team hats and stuff. So they're definitely committed to cards. And for the card community, I think for the most part, that's a good thing, because we need deep pockets. We need a commitment. We need marketing finally in the hobby. Now, the part where I get a little bit concerned is when one company has too much power. Now, if they're making the cards and they're selling the cards and they have outlets to sell the cards and they have an auction house to sell the cards, and now they're also talking about, you know, and it's been speculation that they want to buy a grading company. It just sort of feels like it's the next thing. It's the next step. Like, now they're going to buy a grading company because they've basically picked up all of the different pieces besides that are super important to the hobby. Now, why Beckett? Why is there speculation? There's been a lot of speculation. There are a lot of people out there that have speculated that Beckett is the company. Now, for one, Beckett, I think, is maybe struggling a little bit with evolving as a company. They relied on their price guide for a long time, and then they quickly got into the grading game after, you know, PSA and after SGC. They got in there and they became one of the premium options for a while. And the thing about Beckett is they already have the established name in the company, right? if we look in the space of card grading, you think of PSA, you think of SGC, and you think of Beckett. In, which order kind of depends on who you ask. But when we talk about sports cards in general, Beckett has been an important part of the hobby for a very, very long time. And we all pretty much know the name of the company, and we've all had experiences with the company, and a lot of those experiences have been positive. But their turnaround times right now on their cards is not very fast. The communication on the cards is not very fast. The one thing that they did that was really a smart move, but for whatever reason didn't seem to catch on, were the subgrades. The subgrades were a great idea. I think all companies should be doing subgrades. And to a certain extent, I really like that they still have subgrades. But they don't really seem like they're eager to gain market share. They seem kind of content with where they are. And they're not really doing a ton of promos. They're not really improving communication. They're not really improving turnaround times. They're not really working on their pricing strategies. And I have cards graded by BGS. I mean, so it's not like I'm against Beckett. I'm just kind of stating what a lot of people commonly believe about Beckett. So if Fanatics were to buy someone, that is logical. They bought out a company, Topps, that is like one of the main names in the hobby. See, when you're marketing something, one of the difficult things is the brand recognition, the name recognition. So buying Topps makes it a lot easier than starting from scratch. And buying an existing grading company would be a lot easier than trying to build a brand new brand of grading companies. Will Fanatics get involved? I don't know. A lot of people think they're going to. If they do, it will be really interesting to see what sorts of partnerships that arm of the company does with the Topps arm of the company, as was mentioned in one of the comments. So it is a tough question, and it's one of the reasons I asked it. And one of the parts about it that's tough is not knowing what this massive, beast in the card space now, Fanatics, is going to do. I don't really see them buying PSA. I don't really see them buying SGC. Will they buy anyone? Will they start one from scratch? I have a feeling they're going to try to get involved. And if they get involved, they'll be a player. They will make noise. They will make sure that we know that they are around and exist. One of the reasons I started with this comment, is these two comments, is because if Fanatics gets involved, everything kind of goes out the window because they're such a massive force in where, cards are going, that would obviously change things. But there are a couple other themes. There are a couple other responses. So, sometimes when I'm communicating with you guys, everyone has a different opinion. And then sometimes there's like one opinion. And then sometimes there's a couple of opinions. There were three main topics, three main themes of things that people were responding with. So let's go ahead and take a look at the second thing that a lot of people had to say.
All right, so the second common theme was that PSA would continue to dominate in 5 years. I believe PSA will still dominate the card grading scene. They will continue to expand in the US, internationally, and be the first of the big four to use AI to grade modern cards, though vintage will still need to be done by humans. The registry and financial backing they have will continue to allow them to be a mainstay and, most likely, still run the show, really. As for your question, this is another response on the grading companies. I think PSA has their hooks into people's perception and buyers have bought into the brand that it is the only one worth purchasing. Next, in 5 years, with PSA continuing to be king of the hill, the surge in grading peaked during the pandemic and prices are cooling off and won't recover to the levels back then. People had more disposable income back then, and the coming economic downturn will diminish grading and prices. Although SGC has carved a nice second-place niche, and we all love to hate on PSA's lack of transparency and customer service, an 80% to 20% is hard to change in just 5 years. Another commenter says, 20 years ago I was cracking discounted cases of 2001 Upper Deck Golf and grading with BGS because they were the best value at the time. That tells me a lot can happen in 20 years. However, in only 5 years, I believe PSA will continue to dominate the grading space. The others just haven't done enough to differentiate themselves. Another commenter says, in 5 years, PSA will continue to be the dominant company, with SGC slowly inching their way closer, maybe to half the volume. I personally prefer SGC and only grade with them. And finally, PSA is Nike and SGC is Adidas. Beckett is Under Armour. Even when Nike temporarily slips, they always self-correct and re-cement their status as the top dog. PSA will do the same, and everyone currently switching to SGC will probably be switching back in 5 years.
Oh man, there's a lot covered there. I'm going to do my best to give my take on those opinions. And most of that I agree with. A lot of that I agree with. And some of that I don't. Now, first thing I'll say is this. You know, in college, I was actually a business marketing major. And the thing we did time and time and time again was case study after case study after case study, where we would take real companies, real situations that companies faced, and try to figure out a strategy for that company, given the situation. And then after the fact, we found out what the company actually did. And one of my biggest things that we repeatedly learned and were taught about and saw over and over and over is that two of the strongest things that are so hard to change is, number one, culture. Culture is hard to change. When somebody's been doing something for a long time, it's very difficult to get them to switch. For example, there are Ford people. There are Chevrolet people, right? There are Toyota people. There are Honda people. And it's really difficult to get somebody who's a Ford person. And you know the Ford people I'm talking about. There are Ford people that are just all in on Ford. It's very difficult for them to change brand loyalty. For them to go from a Ford F-150 that they've driven for 40 years to a Dodge Ram, for a Ford person, is not very likely. So changing somebody's culture, changing somebody's belief doesn't happen very often. But when people switch, it's usually because they got burned, and they got burned badly. So if you've been a Ford person forever, and then something happens with you and Ford, and you get a bad situation, and you just feel completely disrespected, then you'll leave. There are a lot of people that have been leaving PSA. And they've been leaving PSA because of, like it was mentioned, things like some customer service things, some pricing things, some turnaround time things. But when you have kind of brand loyalty, brand loyalty doesn't just change at the flick of a switch. It changes because something happened, they didn't fix it, you felt disrespected, and you turn on them. And that does happen. So I don't know if a lot of the PSA people that have gone to SGC are going to go back to PSA. I don't know if that's going to happen, because once you leave, it's rare that you come back. We've all had an experience where we feel we were mistreated. And it's hard once you've left to go back. Now, the other thing that we talked about just relentlessly in my schooling, in my classes, in my projects, in my, papers was the most important thing is being first. It's being first to a company. Now, you can go into a lot of industries. Scotch tape, right? It's not called Scotch tape. There is a brand called Scotch, and they make tape, but it's actually transparent tape, right? Band-Aids are actually bandages. A lot of us call them Band-Aids because the biggest bandage brand are Band-Aid. Q-tip, people call them Q-tips, but they're cotton swabs. Q-tip is just the first and biggest and best company. I mean, it's even gotten into technology with things like Google. Well, just Google it. Well, there are other search engines, although Google tends to buy a lot of those. There are other search engines out there, but they were kind of one of the first huge ones. Now, there were some other ones. Yahoo had a search engine for a while, and there were a few. But then there are companies that had a huge advantage and everybody was with, and then they bailed on them, like America Online. See, America Online was like the first massive company for internet service provider. And like everyone I knew had AOL. Everyone had AOL. And do you know what switched it? Well, a couple things happened. One, DSL, some of the faster speeds. But the thing that switched it was, I remember there was one holiday season one year where a bunch of people got computers and a bunch of people got internet access. And you'd go to dial up to connect to the internet, and you'd get busy signals from AOL. And when people got those busy signals over and over and over and over, people started leaving AOL. And then the other problem is AOL didn't evolve. They didn't change. They didn't grow. They didn't improve. So people left. It's hard for people to leave. The Ford people want to stay Ford people. But if Ford doesn't improve technology and Ford does you wrong, you will leave. It's the same thing for grading. See, PSA was the first. PSA has been the biggest. And there's a lot of brand loyalty from a lot of people. A lot of people want their collection to be the same. They want all of the cases to be the same size. And staying with PSA allows that. So a lot of me agrees with what all these people are saying, which is that PSA is going to continue to be number one, even though they've got some issues. Because they were first, there's brand loyalty. We have a culture of this is where I go. This is who I go through. This is the grading company I use. But people will leave them if they feel like they got mistreated, and if PSA doesn't continue to evolve and improve. So in 5 years, I do think PSA will probably still be number one. But PSA is starting to get into a dangerous territory, in my opinion, where they're starting to upset some people, whether it be on return times, whether it be on a lack of pricing improvements, whether it be on, consistency of grading. We've all heard the complaints. And there are complaints with all the companies. But I've seen more people be open to companies besides PSA than I did a few years ago. I feel like the SGC adoption is growing and growing and growing. And I really think that once people leave, they're not going back. I really think that. Now, I personally have some strong opinions on what I think SGC could and should do to position themselves to continue to eat away at market share from PSA. I think they have done some things where they could position themselves in a way to make a pretty big impact in the next 5 years. And I do think SGC's leadership is very good, and I don't know what their plans are. I would love to talk to the CEO of SGC. I would love to give my opinions and my insights. And I have reached out to SGC and said, come on my show, let's talk about grading. And so far I've heard back, we'll get back to you. And I hope that they do. I hope that they are willing to come on the show, because I do think they have a lot of potential. I do think there are some things in there that they could really do to make a pretty big impact and continue to grow their market share. So I have a hard time disagreeing with people saying PSA will still be in the lead. I think they probably will, but we'll see. But there's one more theme that I heard a few times that I think we have to make note of. We have to acknowledge. We have to talk about. So let's look at that third one right now.
All right, so the third kind of theme in the responses. Now, here's a really well thought out response, but there's a portion of it that I really wanted to feature for you. And that is the portion where it talks about this. In the next 5 years, PSA will still be the leader in grading cards, but with the AI development, they may not be as important as they were in the future. TAG is already using detailed digital imaging with modern cards. The company that uses detailed digital imaging with vintage cards and develops a standard program will be the next winner in grading. Another commenter says, if you were offering odds, I bet TAG. The amount of details they give and the objectiveness they provide is the only company that exists now that I can think of that can disrupt PSA. Now, if we look over at TAG's website, and I'm going to talk more about them in a second, this is their current pricing and what is included in the pricing. And they give a detailed report on every card that is graded. The prices aren't crazy for grading and what's included. And the cases are pretty sleek looking, which we'll take a look at here in just a second. So I think TAG does have some potential. So I wanted to take you over to TAG's website. And it's cool. It talks about being the future of grading. It talks about the digital reports. It's got all this cool information. And again, the pricing's not crazy. So TAG is a completely computerized evaluation system. So it takes the human error out of it. But at the same time, it takes the ability to think out of it. And you look at that card spinning there. That card has got a pretty darn cool looking slab. It's even got, a scannable tag there so you can look at the report and all the information about the card. It talks about the UV, protectant that the cases have. It's pretty cool. Now, if you take the human out of the grading process and you leave it just to computers, the good thing is that you can't have bias. You can't have preference. You can't have, somebody being in a particularly good or bad mood.
All right. What do you all think of tag? My take on tag is it's sort of like, do we want a human being calling balls and strikes? Or do we want a computer system calling balls and strikes? We have the technology right now for a baseball game. When there's a pitch, they will show us a 3D model of whether that pitch crossed in the strike zone. Yet we choose, or the people in power, choose to still have a human make the call. We haven't gone to a strictly computerized system. And that's interesting. And it's sort of like, challenges in football. Like, you challenge a play, they go back, they look at the instant replay, and then they decide whether or not, the foul was the foul, or the ball was in, or the ball was out, or whatever it is that the person or the team is challenging. And then we go, well, you only have so many challenges. Well, why? I guess because it disrupts the flow of the game, right? So I guess the question is, could a computer software program get the grades right? I think they probably could. But they can't think. So, for example, if there's a certain set from a certain year where there's always a rough cut along the edge, for example, the tag program might freak out when it sees that rough edge. But if it's from a certain set, you might go, oh, but that's always in that set. It's not going to have a clean edge like a 2022 Topps Chrome card. The paper quality was less. So the texture of the paper actually has texture. Whereas, you look at some cards now and they're just like perfectly smooth. So will it see all of that texture in the paper as a defect? So those are some of the concerns when you have a computer doing it. Is a human can look at the texture of the card and go, oh, this is from the 1957 Topps set, and the texture is this way because that's the type of paper that was used when they made the cards. And a computer program, would they be able to calibrate that? I like the idea of getting it right. I like the idea of no bias. I like the idea of a person can't grade one card one way and a different card a different way just because of their mood or the other human factors. So I do think a lot of people feel that way, especially some people who feel like they were done wrong recently from grading. Will tag catch on? I think it might. I think it has the possibility to be a disruptor in the market. When we say, will PSA still be number one, and will, the top 3 or 4 still be the top 3 or 4, one of the biggest things that could affect that is whether Fanatics gets involved and how they get involved. Another thing that could affect that is tag and whether people adopt this technology of a computer without a brain and emotion and feeling and moods is grading instead of a human. I think it has possibility. I think in 5 years, if we look back, it's possible that tag has either been acquired by one of the other companies, partnered where it's like SGC grading via tag technology, possibly. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about. It's an interesting thing to talk about. But I do believe tag is going to make an impact somehow in grading over the next 5 years. I really appreciate all of the comments that everybody had. I thought people had great things to say. If I featured your comment, thank you. If I didn't feature your comment, it's not like it was a bad comment. It's just some of the parts of some of these comments kind of stood out to me a little bit. And they were things I wanted to share. And I think that some of the thoughts that a lot of you had and have are similar to a lot of other people on this. I don't think there were a ton of people that said SGC's definitely going to be number one. PSA's definitely going away. There wasn't a lot of that. I think a lot of us have seen over the last, 25 years, it's been PSA, SGC and Beckett have been around and have been involved. And in those 30 years, nothing really disruptive has happened. So why would it happen in the next 5? But I think that it could. I think it's going to be something we should watch because it definitely is going to impact the hobby if it does, in fact, change. So, my question for this coming week. Here is my question for all of you for this coming week. If you were to pick one player, doesn't matter the sport, could be baseball, basketball, football, hockey, soccer, anything, and you were to pick one person whose cards are the most undervalued, the most underappreciated. And I know I'm going to have people go, well, cards are the value that they are because of how appreciated they are. I understand that. And I understand that the demand, a lot of it has to do with the popularity. And the popularity has a lot to do with the likability. And it's not just a matter of how good a player was. It's about how beloved the player was. I get all of that. I really do get all of that. But of all the cards that are out there, of all the sports that are out there, who do you think is the single person with the most undervalued cards? I think this is a really, really interesting question that could have 100 different responses, and all 100 could be great responses. So I look forward to seeing what you all post over the next few days, and I look forward to sharing some of those responses next Monday. I appreciate everybody watching. I appreciate everybody commenting. I hope that you comment on this question because I'm really interested in what you all have to say.